All right, we're about to dive into a question that has kept thinkers up at night for, well, millennia. What is God? And I don't mean in a religious sense. We're talking about a pure, logical concept. Can the very idea of a perfect, ultimate being actually hold up under a microscope? Let's find out. You know, right out of the gate, we smack into a huge wall. Just think about it for a second. Our language, our entire way of thinking, is built to describe things that have limits, things with edges. But how in the world do you use that same language to describe something that is, by its very nature, limitless? How do you define the undefinable? That's the core puzzle we're tackling today. So, just to be super clear about our game plan here, we are setting aside faith, scripture, all of that. This isn't about belief. It is purely about logic. We're putting the idea of divinity on a workbench, taking it apart to see if the pieces even fit together without contradicting each other. Think of it like a philosophical stress test. Okay, so let's start with the most fundamental question you can ask. One or many. Is the ultimate reality a single unified being, or is it more like a committee, a pantheon of divine forces? It sounds pretty simple, right? But as you're about to see, both answers create some seriously tricky problems.
Now, before we go any further, we need to get this key term on the table, aseity. It sounds fancy, but it just means being completely self-sufficient. An entity with aseity needs nothing, depends on nothing, and wasn't caused by anything else. It is the ultimate independent. This is the gold standard. This is what every model of divinity is trying and struggling to achieve.
And here we have our first huge trade-off. On one hand, you've got monotheism. This gives you that single, perfect being, what philosophers called actus purus, meaning it's pure actuality with no unfulfilled potential. It totally nails that self-sufficiency, that aseity we just talked about. But what's the downside? A being that complete is also completely alone and kind of unknowable. It can't really interact with anything without becoming dependent in some way. On the other hand, your pluralism with multiple gods. This solves the relationship problem for sure. But then you have to ask, who's really in charge? The rules that govern how they interact, that becomes the true ultimate power, which means that gods themselves are no longer ultimate. So you see the bind we're in, right? The very moment you have more than one ultimate being, you suddenly have relationships, and those relationships create dependencies. And that just shatters the core requirements of absolute independence. It really seems that, logically speaking, divinity has to be a club of one. Okay, so if we're working with a single divine entity, the next obvious question is, where is it? Is it a creator totally separate from the universe, completely transcendent? Or is it somehow inside the universe, present in everything, what you'd call immanent? The whole idea of a transcendent creator really leans on this concept, the causa prima, or the first cause. It's the ultimate domino, the one that starts the entire chain reaction of the universe, without ever being pushed itself. This is that classic image of the creator, right? Existing before and totally outside of everything else. And this leads us to our second big dilemma. A transcendent God, the first cause, stays perfect, pure, untouched by the messiness of the world. But it's also incredibly distant. It's like the watchmaker who builds a beautiful watch and then just leaves. It's powerful, sure, but also kind of irrelevant to the day-to-day ticking. Now, an immanent God, what the philosopher Spinoza called God or nature, is the total opposite. It's everywhere, it's in everything. So it's deeply relevant, but it also gets tangled up in all the change and messiness of reality. It's no longer perfectly independent. Now, some thinkers have tried to have their cake and eat it too with this idea called panentheism. The idea here is that the universe is in God, kind of like a fish is in the ocean. The ocean contains the fish, but it's also so much more than the fish. It's a really neat idea, but it doesn't quite solve the problem. Because if the fish gets sick, the water right around it is affected. The divine is still compromised by its connection to the world, and it loses that perfect, untouchable independence. We just keep landing in the same fundamental trap, don't we? To be relevant, divinity has to be involved. But involvement means being limited. To be unlimited, divinity has to be totally uninvolved, and therefore totally irrelevant. It's this philosophical tightrope with absolutely no safe place to stand. This brings us to our third and, I think, final dilemma. And this one zeroes in on the very act of creation. Honestly, this one might be the most beautiful and elegant logical trap of them all. Okay, follow the logic with me here step by step. For a divine being, the creation of the universe had to be one of two things. It was either a necessary act, something that had to happen, or it was a free choice. So let's go down that first path. What if it was necessary? Well, if creating the universe was something God had to do, then God isn't really free, is it? It becomes a puppet of its own nature. But a perfect, all-powerful being can't be forced or compelled to do anything, not even by itself. So that option looks like a dead end.
All right, so scratch that. Let's back up and take the other path. What if creating the universe was a totally free and deliberate choice? This seems a lot better, right? It preserves divine freedom. But it leads us straight into another, more subtle problem. I mean, think about any choice you make. It implies a reason, a purpose, an intention. You choose to do something because you want something. And wanting something implies that you don't already have it. It implies a lack or a need. And that's the trap. It's brilliant. If creation was necessary, God isn't free. If creation was a choice, God wasn't perfect to begin with, because it must have lacked something that creation would fulfill. Both paths lead straight to a logical contradiction. So how can a perfect, self-sufficient being lack anything? The logical answer is, it can't. So wow, we've hit a logical wall at every single turn. Where in the world does that leave us? Well, maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe the point of an exercise like this isn't to solve the puzzle of divinity, but to simply understand the shape of the puzzle itself, to see the tensions that are baked right into the very idea. This table right here, it sums up our whole journey perfectly. Every single attempt to pin down divinity with logic forces a trade-off. The push for singularity and ultimate power, it leads to total isolation. The desire for relevance and presence, it sacrifices perfection. The very act of creation implies either a lack of freedom or a lack of self-sufficiency. And the core idea of infinity itself, it resists any neat little definition our finite minds can possibly come up with. So, faced with all these paradoxes, some philosophers land on this absolutely fascinating approach called apophatic theology. The argument is that we simply can't say what God is. We can only say what God is not. It is not finite, not limited, not weak. It's not a being in the same way a person or a planet is a being. You see, any positive label you stick on it automatically creates a boundary, a limit, and that contradicts the whole idea of the infinite. And this leads to one final, really mind-bending shift in perspective. What if divinity isn't a thing in the universe at all? Not even the biggest, most powerful thing. What if it's more like the operating system for reality? Not a character in the story, but the very possibility for a story to exist in the first place. The enabling condition for being itself. And that leaves us with this final thought. The divine is not a solution to a problem, but the horizon against which the problem is seen. Perhaps the goal of all this was never to give us a neat and tidy answer. Maybe it was just to help us appreciate the profound, incredible depth of the question itself. It points us right to the limits of our own reason, and it invites not certainty, but a kind of beautiful intellectual humility.